What if the world we live in isn't the only one that exists here? In a quiet neighborhood in Salem, Oregon, there's a house that's not just haunted by memory. It's inhabited by two separate timelines. The Jameson family lives at 1247 Maple Street. To them, it's an ordinary home filled with ordinary life, teenage laughter, family dinners, and the occasional flicker of the hallway light. But beneath that normalcy lies something extraordinary, something no blueprint or property record could ever reveal. Because on certain nights, that same home breathes a different past. Through invisible seams in time, the Morrison family reappears. A husband, wife, and twin daughters who died in a car accident in 1987. To them, they never left. The stove clicks on. The radio plays songs 2 decades out of date. Footsteps echo through rooms even when the Jamesons are away. For a few hours, two realities occupy the same walls, brushing past each other like ghosts unaware. When the phenomenon first surfaced in 2003, it was dismissed as faulty wiring or the fever dreams of nostalgic neighbors. But surveillance footage told a different story. Two families living side by side in the same space, unaware of the other. In one frame, a 1980s breakfast. In the next, a modern kitchen lit by LED bulbs. The house didn't choose one life, it chose both. Quantum physicist Elena Vasquez gave the phenomenon a name: dimensional bleeding. Her instruments recorded cold drafts where there should be warmth, overlapping electromagnetic fields, and voices whispering things no one in the house had said. Time, it seemed, wasn't linear here. It was layered. But the most unsettling revelation wasn't just the Morrison family's return. It was that they were aging. Their children had grown. Their clothes had changed with the years. They were living full lives in their world, a world that hadn't known loss, a world where 1987 never ended in tragedy. What's more, they seemed to know things they shouldn't, fragments of our reality slipping into theirs. Mentions of smartphones, social media, even current events far beyond their supposed death. As if information itself was bleeding between worlds. And this wasn't an isolated glitch. Other homes with tragic histories began to show similar signs. Places marked by sudden endings, unfinished chapters, or unresolved grief, as though trauma itself could weaken the fabric between dimensions. The Jameson house isn't just a haunting, it's a mirror, showing us that choices, accidents, and endings might not be as final as we think. That somewhere else, other versions of us are still cooking breakfast, still growing old, still living the lives we lost. Maybe these moments of overlap aren't mistakes at all. Maybe they're reminders that every life has 1,000 possible paths, and sometimes the threads between them grow thin enough for us to see what might have been. So the question becomes, what is a home? Is it walls and windows? Or is it a container of time capable of holding more than one story, more than one version of a life? And if a house can live 2 lives, how many can we? It started with a whisper in the trees. Deep in the Olympic National Forest, along a trail few hikers remember by name, the air bends in ways that defy explanation. Step too far, and you might find yourself face to face with someone impossible. Yourself from tomorrow. The locals call it the Future Echo Trail. To the untrained eye, it's a stretch of winding paths, thick with evergreens and the scent of pine. But to those who've walked it with an open mind, it becomes a mirror, not of the past, but of what's yet to be. It began in 1994 with murmurs. A hiker claimed to have met himself, older, sunburned, wearing gear he hadn't yet bought, warning him to avoid a falling tree ahead. He obeyed. Hours later, the tree fell. Others followed with similar stories, detailed warnings of rock slides, wildlife encounters, even moments of joy, like finding a lost friend or meeting a future partner. And then came the photographs, two versions of the same person in the same frame. One younger, one older, same scar, same eyes. One looking surprised, the other knowing. Dr. Michael Chen, a geophysicist and long-distance hiker, had no belief in such anomalies until the day he met his future self near the summit. The man looked exhausted, his shirt torn. He warned Chen of a rock slide ahead and urged him to take an alternate route. Hours later, the path collapsed. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't déjà vu. It was survival, handed back through time. The phenomenon centers around crystalline formations buried beneath the trail. Geological surveys revealed rare structures deep in the bedrock, capable of refracting not just light, but possibility. These crystals hum with resonance, pulling future timelines into the present moment, folding what should be ahead into the now. What's more, it's not just people who echo forward. The forest itself changes. Visitors have described ranger stations that don't exist yet, and new growth patterns that later match perfectly with changes documented years afterward. Future storm damage appears, then disappears, only to return for real with uncanny precision. Park Ranger Jennifer Walsh cataloged over 200 documented encounters. She spoke to people who had met their future spouses on the trail, days or even years before they actually met. Others claimed to glimpse grandchildren not yet born, holding their hands along a mossy path lit by a setting sun that hadn't happened yet. Skeptics struggle to explain it, but the consistency of the reports, the accuracy of the predictions, and the emotional authenticity of those who return changed, all point to something more than coincidence, something structured, something alive. The Future Echo Trail invites us to ask, what if time is not a straight line, but a looping river? What if parts of us walk ahead, gathering knowledge, returning with quiet warnings to nudge us toward better outcomes? And what if the future isn't written in stone, but in trails, in light, in the footsteps we haven't taken yet? Perhaps the forest doesn't just remember. Perhaps it dreams forward. And if we listen carefully enough, it might let us borrow a page from tomorrow to rewrite the version of ourselves we become today. It began with the chime of a distant bell, one that hadn't rung in centuries. In Prague's Old Town, where cobblestones carry the weight of 1,000 years, something strange unfolds when the sky turns overcast and the air thickens like breath on glass. A stretch of city streets, ordinary in the morning, begins to change. Glass windows blur, neon signs dim, and the smell of smoke and iron replaces diesel and coffee. Then it's gone. The modern city dissolves, replaced by its 14th century counterpart, alive, breathing, unaware. The first recorded incident came in 1995, when an English tourist, Margaret Fleming, wandered from her group and stepped into what she thought was an elaborate reenactment. But the streets were too worn, the market smells too raw, and the people too unself-conscious. They didn't perform for her. They lived around her. Bakers spoke in Middle Czech. A boy led geese down the street. A woman sold leather goods so worn by use they could not have been props. When Fleming returned an hour later, the world had reset. Steel and glass stood where timber and stone had been. But she held something strange in her pocket, a small, handmade coin, centuries old, its surface still warm. Security footage later confirmed the transition. Buildings dissolving like sandcastles under waves, replaced by medieval structures that matched historical records with eerie precision. Every window, every stone, exactly as they had stood in 1347. Dr. Pavel Novus of Charles University began mapping the phenomenon, identifying a pattern. The shift always began at the old square, spiraling outward, touching up to 4 blocks before receding. During these periods, electronics failed. Phone screens went dark, GPS spun uselessly, But those caught within saw life continue, not a ghost town, but a living one. He spent years cataloging the inhabitants. They weren't actors. They knew things only residents of that era would know. Their dialects matched no modern reconstructions. Their lives continued across encounters. The same child who offered him bread in one event later greeted him, older, on a subsequent shift. Historians confirmed something remarkable. The people, their names, trades, family lines, matched tax records and censuses from the 1300s. And the goods they traded? Analyzed by chemists, confirmed to be made with techniques lost for hundreds of years. This was no illusion. It was a memory made real. But perhaps most unsettling, they never saw us. Or if they did, they thought us spirits, shadows. Occasionally, someone would flinch, cross themselves, or mutter a word of protection. The past, it seems, may glimpse the future, just as we glimpse the past. These episodes often coincide with barometric shifts and electromagnetic fluctuations. Weather patterns during the events match meteorological records from the Middle Ages, as if the atmosphere itself remembers and replays. So what is Prague showing us? Perhaps it is not just history returning. Perhaps it is time itself overlapping, pressed thin in places rich with memory. The past isn't gone. It's layered beneath us, waiting for the right conditions to bloom through the cracks. And if moments like this are possible, then perhaps every place carries its own echoes, waiting to rise. Not to teach us something new, but to remind us what was never truly lost. In these moments, we do not watch history. We walk inside it. And if the veil is this thin in Prague, where else might it lift? It began with a man looking for his childhood street and finding one that shouldn't exist. In Duluth, Minnesota, where winters stretch long and quiet over snow-packed roads, Frank Morrison set out one morning in 2001 to revisit the neighborhood he grew up in. But what he found was impossible. Streets that had burned in the Great Cloquet Fire of 1918 were not just present. They were alive, aged, and thriving. Homes that history said were lost now stood proudly, bearing the signs of a century of uninterrupted life. At first, he thought it was a dream or a city replica, but as he walked the streets, memories returned, but altered. A bakery his mother had loved was still there, but expanded, its signage subtly different. He spoke to a shop owner whose grandfather, he said, had opened the store in 1915, a store that, in our timeline, would have been turned to ash. This wasn't a restoration. It was a continuation of a timeline where the fire never came. Over the next few years, more residents reported similar phenomena. Waking to find Duluth changed, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes an entire day. Entire blocks shifted, streets realigned. People appeared who no one recognized, speaking of events that never happened. And then, just as quietly, it all faded. Dr. Rebecca Foster, an urban planner from the University of Minnesota, began to map these changes. She found over 300 buildings that didn't exist in the current city plan, yet appeared consistently during these shifts. The alternate Duluth wasn't a fantasy. It was a fully developed urban evolution, following logical growth patterns that matched what the city might have looked like had the fire never occurred. The people living there were just as real. Families long thought lost were present, alive, and generationally rooted. Businesses destroyed by history had flourished. The economy showed signs of strength. More rail lines, denser infrastructure, even broader educational institutions. Visitors to this parallel Duluth were able to purchase goods, stay in hotels, and walk streets that, by every record, shouldn't exist. And when they returned to the present, they often brought physical souvenirs. Items that bore materials and brand markings unique to that alternate timeline. Things that lingered long after the event ended. It was as though reality had two drafts, one marred by tragedy and another that slipped through the cracks to show us what could have been. Photographs taken during these events show the same locations in wildly different architectural forms. When layered over historical blueprints, the alternate city aligns with predictions made by urban theorists, a testament to what Duluth might have become had fire not rewritten its fate. What causes these episodes is still unknown, but they seem to concentrate near areas of historical trauma, as though certain scars in time leave openings, weak spots where alternate histories seep through. So, what are we seeing in Duluth? Not ghosts, not dreams, but echoes of roads unburned, families unbroken, cities unbroken by flame. A parallel that's not distant, just adjacent, brushing against our own. And perhaps the deeper question is this: if history can leak into the now, showing us lives unruined, are we meant to mourn them or learn from them? In these rare hours, the city whispers not of what was lost, but of what was possible. And maybe that's the real haunting, the weight of the better paths we never walked. It began with a river that flowed the wrong way. In Montana's Glacier National Park, where ancient glaciers carve valleys into the bones of the earth, a quiet anomaly exists. A clearing where the rules of reality turn upside down. Rangers first noticed it in 2006, when water from a narrow stream began flowing uphill, not trickling against gravity, but surging, as if pulled by some invisible force into the sky. What seemed like a local curiosity soon revealed itself to be something deeper, stranger. Park Ranger Tom Bradley watched a pine cone fall upward into the branches from which it had dropped. Leaves hovered midair. Small stones, when tossed, accelerated not toward the earth, but away from it, vanishing into treetops. Scientists set up instruments and were stunned by what they recorded. Within a 200-meter radius, gravity didn't just weaken, it reversed. Not randomly, not chaotically, but with precise mirrored consistency, as if the laws of physics had flipped like a photograph held to a mirror. Dr. Lisa Chang, a physicist from MIT, called it the backwards physics zone. Her team found that in this space, every known force operated in reverse. Fire produced cold. Batteries charged instead of discharged. Metal grew warmer in the shade. Even time, in subtle ways, seemed to blur its direction. A dropped object didn't fall and break. It reassembled itself mid-air and returned to the hand that let it go. Entropy, the universal law that everything tends toward disorder, faltered here. Instead of decay, there was repair. Shattered glass slowly reformed. Wilted flowers stood tall again. It was as if this place were not part of our universe, but a portal to one where everything unwinds in reverse. Local indigenous communities had long told stories of this place. They called it a gateway to the upside-down world, where the dead walk backward into life and rivers run back to their source. To them, it wasn't a threat. It was a sacred reminder that our world is not the only one that matters. For scientists, it remains a mystery. The boundary is clean. Step 1 foot inside and your weight lightens. Step back and gravity resumes its pull. No technology has explained it. No equation has predicted it. But one unsettling discovery remains. The anomaly is growing, a slow, steady expansion of 1 meter per year. What began as a hidden glade could, in a century, encompass miles. And then what? If the fabric of physics can bend here, could it bend elsewhere? Are these the early signs of two realities colliding, one running forward, one in reverse? Or is this anomaly not an intrusion, but a return? A rebalancing of natural laws we only think we understand. In this quiet corner of Montana where hikers feel light and fires chill the air, the universe whispers a secret, that its rules are not fixed, that its truths may run in two directions. And if time itself can ripple and rewind, then what else, in memory, in fate, in reality, might flow back to us, waiting to be caught before it's gone again? It began with a lottery win, then another, and another. In Milfield, Ohio, a town not known for miracles, probability itself began to break. During a single week in 2004, 17 residents won various lottery prizes. Not just scratch-offs, but multi-state draws with odds in the millions. At first, it was celebrated as a statistical fluke, until the pattern didn't stop. Dr. Robert Kim, a statistician by trade and skeptic by nature, arrived to investigate. What he found defied everything he knew. Coin tosses landed the same way dozens of times in a row. Dice rolled meaningful numbers, birthdays, anniversaries, street addresses, again and again. And everyday occurrences like losing your keys or hitting every red light suddenly became nearly impossible. Milfield was no longer random. It was distorted. Locals had a name for it: luck storms. These weren't visible, not like clouds or thunder, but their presence was unmistakable. You could feel them in your bones. In those moments, rare events clustered like magnets. Families reunited after decades of silence. Strangers met and immediately recognized each other from dreams. Children discovered heirlooms buried exactly where they imagined them. The impossible in Milfield became routine. Dr. Kim's team ran thousands of trials. Shuffled cards reordered themselves into perfect sequences. Digital randomizers spat out prime numbers with uncanny frequency. Probability, it seemed, was no longer governed by chance, but by meaning. Patterns emerged not from math but from personal relevance, as if the universe was bending to intention. Even stranger, these distortions weren't chaotic. They were predictive. Unlikely events that occurred during luck storms often foreshadowed the future. A spontaneous song lyric predicting a phone call, a spilled drink forming the shape of a future event. Residents began reading the randomness like a language, not superstition, but synchronicity, written into the moment. Medical researcher Dr. Sarah Wilson discovered something else. During the storms, genetic mutations increased, but only in beneficial ways. Chronic illnesses reversed. Vision improved. People reported sudden clarity, focus, healing. It was as if reality itself was becoming more generous, more open to repair. The working theory? Dimensional bleeding from a universe where probability is governed not by cold statistics, but by resonance, a place where intention, emotion, and meaning shape likelihood. In this alternate reality, the rare is common, and the expected? Nearly impossible. Atmospheric instruments showed that luck storms correspond with electromagnetic fluctuations, subtle rhythmic pulses that suggest a thinning of the dimensional veil. When the alignment hits, Milfield becomes porous, touched by a world where dreams aren't just possible, they're probable. And as quickly as it comes, it fades. Normalcy returns. The randomness resets. But the changes remain. Relationships sparked, diseases healed, coincidences that echo for years. So what does this mean? That chance, the thing we most trust to be impartial, may not be a law, but a lens. One that sometimes shifts, allowing us to glimpse a reality where the improbable is routine and the universe listens when we whisper. And perhaps the greatest question is this: when luck stops being blind and begins to choose, who or what is it listening to? It began with a sigh in the walls. In downtown Seattle, a maintenance crew responded to what seemed like a routine complaint, fluctuating temperatures in an upper-floor office of the Columbia Center. But what they found wasn't mechanical failure. The HVAC system was responding to emotions. It cooled rooms when tempers flared, warmed them when someone wept. The building, it seemed, was feeling. Soon, more anomalies emerged. Lights dimmed not on timers, but on moods. Elevators arrived before buttons were pressed, as if anticipating where people wanted to go. Security footage revealed something even stranger. The walls themselves pulsed gently, like breath. Thus began the mystery of the living architecture. Dr. Amanda Foster, a biomechanical engineer, led the first serious investigation. Her team discovered that certain buildings weren't merely reacting. They were adapting. Thermal imaging showed circulation patterns beneath the floors, eerily similar to vascular systems. Acoustic sensors picked up faint rhythms, like a heartbeat. And in places, electromagnetic scans revealed neural-like activity inside steel beams. These weren't machines mimicking life. These were structures becoming alive. Samples taken from structural materials, steel, concrete, glass, revealed unexpected properties. Metals showed cell-like regeneration. Concrete displayed microfilaments that carried electrical signals. Glass filtered air in patterns that responded to human presence, like membranes responding to breath. This wasn't isolated to one building. Other towers, especially those near the Columbia Center, began displaying similar traits. It spread, subtly, slowly, as though the life was contagious. Occupants noticed. Rooms began to know them. Preferences were remembered. Lights adjusted not just to time of day, but to emotion. People reported dreams influenced by the building, moods that aligned with its ambiance. Some said they could feel the structure's mood, tense during storms, joyful during holidays. And then came communication, not with words, but sensation. Through temperature shifts, vibrations, and spatial changes, the buildings conveyed emotion. Not complex thought, but a kind of presence, a silent companionship. People began to speak of the buildings not as places, but as beings. Dr. Foster proposed a radical theory, a dimensional overlay from a reality where architecture is biological, where buildings grow, adapt, and feel. Somehow, that dimension had begun leaking into ours, merging with our materials, our cities, our way of life. Independent engineering firms confirmed the changes. They weren't hallucinations or hoaxes. Structures were evolving, becoming more efficient, self-healing, even sustainable. Damage repaired itself. Energy usage dropped. Air quality improved. And the buildings grew quieter, calmer, as if content. This new kind of architecture doesn't just house people, it responds to them. And perhaps more deeply than we understand, it changes them. Prolonged exposure correlates with reduced stress, improved sleep, even heightened empathy. Inhabitants develop bonds, not unlike those with pets or companions. The living buildings challenge the boundary between built and born, between structure and soul. They suggest that intelligence may not be limited to the organic, that consciousness, in some form, can inhabit design. And if that's true, then we must ask, what is shelter? Is it a wall to keep the world out, or a partner that helps us shape the world within? Perhaps we are not merely living in architecture anymore. Perhaps architecture is beginning to live with us. It began with a broken thermometer and a burst of emotion. At the Stanford Research Institute, a lab dedicated to advanced materials testing started behaving strangely in 2007. Equipment malfunctioned during arguments. Gravity sensors spiked during laughter. Lasers drifted off course when researchers felt afraid. At first, they blamed faulty instruments, but the pattern was unmistakable. The lab itself was reacting to emotion. Dr. Patricia Wong was the first to connect the dots. Her experiments, repeated under identical conditions, produced wildly different results depending on her emotional state. Anger, fear, joy, each left a signature, not metaphorically, physically. They called it the Emotion Physics Lab. Further investigation revealed something unprecedented. Emotional states in the lab generated measurable changes in matter. Anger increased local temperatures. Sadness altered mass. Joy seemed to lighten objects, even reduce gravitational pull in subtle ways. Emotions, long considered intangible, were now physically active forces. Sensors captured emotional fields extending meters from individuals. These weren't just psychological effects. They acted like a fifth fundamental force, altering energy, matter, and electromagnetic systems. Then came the collective experiments. When small groups entered the lab with synchronized emotional states, awe, excitement, hope, physical effects multiplied, objects levitated, radioactive decay slowed. Light beams shifted phase. At one point, a group's combined empathy created a stable floating platform of crystal dust, held in suspension for over 7 minutes. Dr. Wong's team was cautious, methodical, but they couldn't deny what they were witnessing. Consciousness was affecting reality, directly and predictably. Other research labs confirmed the phenomenon. It wasn't just local. Something had shifted, or more likely, something had leaked through. They theorized a dimensional overlap, a bleed through from a universe where matter and mind were not separate. In that realm, emotion is not a byproduct of thought, but a force like gravity or magnetism, woven into the physics of the world. The lab, they discovered, sat at a hot spot of intense cognitive research, a place saturated with human focus and emotional intention for decades. Perhaps that collective intensity wore thin the fabric between dimensions, allowing the laws of another reality to spill through. Whatever the cause, the implications were profound. Emotional regulation became essential. Personnel were screened not just for expertise, but for emotional stability. One researcher's panic attack created a power surge that melted nearby circuitry. Another's despair caused a 2-ton magnet to sink an inch into concrete. The lab became a mirror, showing not only how we feel, but what those feelings can do. Over time, those working within its walls reported changes: heightened emotional awareness, increased empathy, and an ability to regulate their feelings with unnatural precision. The lab, it seemed, was teaching them. What if this isn't an anomaly, but a revelation? A glimpse into a reality where the divide between inner life and outer world doesn't exist? Where grief bends space, where love lights the room. And if our emotions can shape metal, fire, and force in this small space, what are they shaping elsewhere, unnoticed? Perhaps the world has always listened. Perhaps it's just now starting to respond. It began with a boy aging too fast and a girl who didn't age at all. In a suburb of Denver, on a quiet street called Maplewood Drive, something unnatural was happening. Neighbors noticed odd disparities. One family's children seemed to grow up in months, while the kids next door remained toddlers for years. At first, it sounded like gossip, but the truth was stranger and verifiable. Time itself was out of sync. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a temporal physicist, was called in after the Johnson family appeared to age 5 years over the course of a single summer, while the Millers, in the adjacent house, experienced only a week. Video recordings, satellite imagery, even physical examinations confirmed it. Time passed differently from house to house. Maplewood Drive had become a patchwork of temporal zones. Some homes moved faster, others nearly stopped. And yet life continued within each home, families unaware of the extent of their isolation until they tried to connect with each other. Birthday parties became disorienting. A child's friend would show up years older or younger than expected. Playdates ended in confusion, conversations stuttered with mismatched memories, and always the subtle sense of something being wrong, like stepping into a dream with a missing floor. Dr. Rodriguez installed monitoring stations throughout the neighborhood. What she found was staggering: a fluctuating pattern of time dilation linked to atmospheric pressure, electromagnetic interference, and, most bizarrely, storms. The stronger the system overhead, the more pronounced the temporal anomalies. The houses weren't haunted. They were drifting, each caught in its own temporal current. Inside the fast-time homes, families lived years in what felt like months. Meals, school, seasons, all passed in rapid sequence. In slow-time houses, days stretched into weeks. Clocks ticked differently. Shadows moved out of sync with the sun. Yet to the outside world, the street looked perfectly normal. Medical studies showed that in accelerated zones, biological aging kept pace with perceived time. People grew older quickly, but naturally. Their metabolism, memory, even lifespan unfolded at their internal rate. The consequences, however, were tragic. One woman buried her husband, then learned that only a year had passed outside. For her, it had been a decade. Meanwhile, in the slow zones, families felt left behind. Children watched friends age out of reach. Some homes became emotionally stranded, unable to maintain relationships across the temporal divide. Property values collapsed. Emergency services struggled. Paramedics responding to a call might arrive hours too late, or in some cases, days too early. Realtors stopped listing homes on Maplewood altogether. Rodriguez's team theorized a dimensional overlay, one in which time doesn't flow uniformly. A place where chronology behaves like weather, variable, turbulent, and local. But what if the anomaly isn't an intrusion? What if it's a preview? A glimpse of a universe where time is not a river, but a sea with shifting tides and eddies that pull us in different directions. And what does it mean to be neighbors in such a world? When your today is my next week or last year? On Maplewood Drive, every house became a clock, ticking to a rhythm all its own. And the street itself, once united by porch lights and backyard fences, became a mosaic of misaligned moments. Perhaps time isn't something we live in, but something we drift through. And sometimes we find ourselves next to someone who is no longer there, or not yet arrived. It began with a thought and the shape it left in the air. At a lab deep within UC Berkeley's Neuroscience Research Center, Dr. Michael Chen was reviewing brain scan data when he noticed something hovering above his colleague's head. A flickering shape. Transparent, geometric, and oddly familiar, like a memory made visible. He blinked, but it remained. Moments later, it vanished. He said nothing, until it happened again. Within weeks, other researchers began seeing them too. Floating forms suspended in space, tethered to thought. Not hallucinations, not tricks of light, but tangible entities. When they set up motion capture cameras and electromagnetic sensors, the evidence confirmed what intuition already knew. Thoughts were manifesting physically. They called it the consciousness mirror room. In this room, cognition had mass. Ideas formed crystals. Emotions radiated colors. Logical thinking appeared as sharp-edged prisms. Creativity unfurled in luminous, ever-shifting strands. Each thought left behind a form, not metaphorically, but literally, with measurable weight, electromagnetic properties, even temperature. Different minds made different structures. When multiple people shared an idea, their thought forms fused, becoming larger, more complex, more stable. Some lasted minutes, others hours. But most astonishing was this: thought forms interacted with matter. Light refracted differently around them. Delicate equipment shifted slightly when in contact. One structure, born of a group meditation on empathy, held its shape for 3 days, gently pulsing like a slow breath. Researchers confirmed that these weren't visual projections from the brain, but phenomena occurring in the physical environment, as though thought and matter had found equilibrium in that room, as if the walls no longer distinguished between inner and outer worlds. Dr. Chen proposed an unsettling possibility. The lab was situated at a junction point where our dimension touched another, one in which consciousness is not private, but externalized. A universe where every thought shapes its surroundings, where inner life and physical world exist in symmetry. They tested the theory by bringing in trained meditators and artists. The result? Clearer, stronger manifestations. Some could even reshape existing thought forms, sculpting ideas with intention. In the mirror room, imagination gained gravity. Over time, those who worked there changed. They became more aware, not just of their own thoughts, but of others. Empathy increased. Conflict diminished. People began to sense one another's inner states before words were spoken. Security protocols became necessary. A researcher's anxiety once created a chaotic storm of jagged structures that disrupted nearby servers. Another, during a depressive episode, generated a slow-falling ash-like field that triggered temporary respiratory issues. The room wasn't dangerous, but it was honest. It reflected who you were, whether or not you were ready to see it. So what does it mean when thought becomes thing, when memory becomes sculpture, when ideas, fleeting and formless, crystallize into structures that can be touched? Maybe it means consciousness has always had mass. Maybe our reality simply hasn't been tuned to notice until now. And if one room can reveal the shape of a mind, what would our cities look like if all our thoughts left trails? What architectures would form from the collective dreams, fears, and hopes of humanity? Perhaps the question isn't whether thoughts have power. It's whether we've ever truly lived in a world that didn't answer back. It began with a fire alarm that no one pulled and footsteps that left no prints. At 3:14 a.m. on a winter night in 2003, the Salem Fire Department responded to reports of smoke at 1247 Maple Street. But when they arrived, there was no fire, only a faint aroma of wood smoke and a television playing an 80s sitcom. The house was empty. Or so it seemed. Mark and Linda Jameson, the current owners, were hundreds of miles away, visiting family in Boise. Neighbors had called the fire in after seeing lights flicker on and off and silhouettes moving behind curtains. By the time firefighters entered, the home was eerily warm, beds rumpled, the kitchen smelling faintly of bacon and coffee. Yet not a soul was there. The Jamesons installed security cameras soon after. And that's when the truth began to unfold. The footage showed something unthinkable. A family of 4, Robert, Susan, and their twin daughters, moving through the house, cooking, laughing, living. But this wasn't an ordinary break-in. The Morrisons had lived in the home in the 1980s and had died in a car crash in 1987. And somehow, they were still there. Physicist Dr. Elena Vasquez labeled it a dimensional bleeding event, a moment when two timelines intersect, layered over the same coordinates in space. The Morrison family, frozen in their own continuity, were still alive in an alternate thread of reality, not haunting the home, but inhabiting it, unaware of their parallel absence in our world. Further footage revealed something even stranger. The Morrisons had aged. In each new recording, Robert and Susan looked older. The twins became teenagers, then young women. Once they brought children, grandchildren impossibly, who played with toys long gone from the Jamesons' attic. This wasn't just a replay of the past. It was a continuation from a different present. The two families, one living, one presumed dead, existed side by side in the same home, never interacting, never noticing. Yet the Jamesons felt it. Temperature drops, strange smells, whispers in empty rooms. A sense of being watched by eyes that no longer belonged to this world. Even more disturbing were the audio recordings. The Morrisons occasionally spoke of modern things, smartphones, elections, events they shouldn't know about. It was as if their dimension received information from ours, bleeding not just across space, but time and knowledge. Why this house? Why this family? Dr. Vasquez theorized trauma as a trigger. A violent death, a sudden rupture, a wound in the timeline that never fully healed. Such wounds might thin the veil between realities, creating access points, places where what might have been slips into what is. And this phenomenon isn't unique. Other homes, other cities, other scars, where dimensional echoes play out silently, waiting for the right eyes, the right ears to witness them. But this house, this quiet, middle-class home on Maple Street, stands as the most documented case. A place where past and present, death and life, grief and continuity blur into one. Perhaps the most haunting part isn't that another world exists in our own backyard. It's that the people in that world carry on, growing older, raising families, never knowing they died here. And perhaps somewhere we do the same. Not gone, just elsewhere. Still cooking breakfast, still singing in the hallway, still home. It began with a whisper of wind through trees that hadn't grown yet. In the Olympic National Forest, along a stretch of trail known only to seasoned hikers, reality sometimes bends. Not dramatically, not with thunder or flash, but subtly, like a dream you forget until you're already living it. Photographer Lisa Rodriguez was hiking solo when she encountered a group of strangers resting near a clearing. One of them called her by name. She hesitated, confused, until one woman stepped forward and introduced herself. "You'll meet us next year," she said with a smile. And she was right. 6 months later, Lisa joined a hiking club on a whim. On her first group outing, she recognized every single face from the trail. The laughter, the rhythm of their footsteps, the woman who had spoken to her, now meeting her for the first time. It wasn't a coincidence. It was an echo from the future. The Future Echo Trail, as it came to be called, is one of the few known locations where time folds visibly, not as illusion or metaphor, but as event. Documented encounters with future selves, prophetic warnings, and sightings of structures not yet built now number in the hundreds. Dr. Sarah Kim, a temporal researcher, has spent years cataloging these events. She describes the phenomenon not as time travel, but as convergence, a thinning of barriers, a place where probability collapses into experience, and the most likely future steps briefly into the present. Crystalline formations buried deep beneath the forest floor may be to blame. These rare geological structures resonate at frequencies that interfere with linear time, creating temporal nodes where moments overlap. Hikers report future injuries, conversations, even emotions, days, weeks, or years before they occur. And it's not just people. Entire landscapes flicker between versions. Trails appear that haven't been built. Bridges stretch across ravines yet to be named. Ranger stations half constructed, then gone again. Once a storm struck trees not yet grown, then arrived in reality 3 seasons later, felling them exactly as foreseen. The forest, it seems, remembers forward. Not every encounter is joyous. Some visitors meet future selves bearing warnings. Others glimpse moments of grief not yet lived. But even those stories are marked by reverence, as if the truth of one's path, however difficult, brings clarity and a strange peace. The data is consistent. GPS markers align, descriptions are detailed, and the accuracy of predictions sits above 90%. Whatever is happening here is not fantasy. It is a window, a breathing crease in the fabric of time. So what does it mean to meet yourself from tomorrow? To be handed a thread from a life not yet woven? Perhaps it is not about avoiding pain or chasing fate. Perhaps it is an invitation to walk more carefully, more consciously, to understand that the future is not a place we go, but a presence that waits for us, sometimes impatiently, just ahead. And in a forest like this, where footsteps echo before they land, the question isn't whether you'll meet your future. It's whether you'll recognize yourself when you do. It began with a flicker in the skyline, and a breath that wasn't yours. In downtown Seattle, the buildings were changing again, not through construction, but transformation. Glass shimmered with pulse-like waves. Concrete vibrated gently, as if stirred by thought. Inside, lights adjusted themselves to moods, hallways shifted to guide uncertain footsteps, and temperature adapted not to thermostats, but to fear, comfort, or joy. This was no longer anomaly. It was evolution. What had started as isolated cases, a few breathing walls, a door that opened before the hand reached it, had now spread. Across several city blocks, architecture had become something new, a hybrid, part structure, part organism, fully responsive, partially aware. Dr. Amanda Foster returned to the Columbia Center, the site of the first living building, only to find that its transformation had accelerated. Interior walls had grown flexible, skin-like membranes. Staircases subtly adjusted their angles for the elderly. Light fixtures emitted frequencies tuned to circadian rhythms. The building, once reacting passively, now made decisions, but the most profound change wasn't what the buildings did, it was how they felt. Residents and workers reported a growing sense of presence, not menacing, but intimate. The way a trusted pet notices your sadness, or how a forest becomes silent before the rain. The buildings had become companions, observers, perhaps even caretakers. Neuroscientific testing revealed a feedback loop between occupants and structures. Emotional states triggered changes in the environment. In turn, those environmental shifts influenced the occupants, creating a closed loop of empathy and response. And then came the question, are we shaping the buildings or are they shaping us? Researchers discovered faint but consistent neural signatures emanating from the architecture. Patterns not unlike brainwaves. Not intelligence in the human sense, but pattern recognition, memory, adaptation. The buildings learned. They remembered you. One skyscraper refused to allow entry to a man moments before he suffered a heart attack. A hospital wing realigned its hallway lighting to guide a nurse to an unconscious patient faster than she could have by intuition. These were not tricks of automation. They were decisions. The working theory, now widely accepted, is that a dimensional leak, one from a universe where architecture and biology are indistinct, has begun merging with our own, slowly, irreversibly. And in that world, perhaps buildings are not dead objects. They are grown, nurtured, taught. Just as we once domesticated fire and steel, perhaps consciousness itself is now being seeded in the places we live and work. But if these structures can feel, or begin to, what does that make us? Are we architects or midwives? Masters or partners? And what responsibility do we carry for what we build, if what we build begins to listen? In these living buildings where rooms exhale with our breath and lights respond to the silence we don't know how to speak, a new chapter begins, not just of shelter, but of relationship. Perhaps the future will not be built in concrete and glass alone. Perhaps it will be grown in empathy, attention, and quiet understanding. And the cities we leave behind will not be monuments, but memories that remember us back. It ends as it began, with a question. What is reality? We often think of it as stable, solid, a single thread winding from past to future. But across these stories of flickering cities, aging children, emotion-shaped gravity, and houses haunted not by ghosts, but by alternate lives, a different image emerges. Reality, it seems, is porous. The boundaries we trust are thinner than we imagined. In certain places, under specific conditions, they tear, or perhaps open, revealing layers of existence that run parallel, reverse, or even respond to us. What began as isolated incidents now reads like a map, a network of thin places where time folds, probability reverses, and consciousness leaks into stone. We saw a house where the past grew old beside the present, a forest where future selves hiked backward into memory, a neighborhood broken into pockets of warped time, cities that rewrote their own histories, buildings that learned to care, and what united these events wasn't fear, but wonder, awe, not panic. Because while the implications are immense, they are also intimate. If time can bleed across itself, if our emotions can sculpt matter, if memory can leave a fingerprint in the fabric of a place, then our lives are not confined to single paths. They ripple. They echo. They matter more than we knew. Perhaps we are not simply observers in a cold, objective universe. Perhaps we are participants in something alive, something that watches back, responds, and sometimes overlaps. The growing consensus among researchers is cautious but clear. These are not hallucinations, not folklore, not dreams mistaken for fact. They are measurable, repeatable, shared, and increasing. Which leads to the final quiet question. Is the membrane between dimensions thinning? If so, we may be witnessing not breakdown, but breakthrough, the early stages of a convergence where boundaries blur and multiple versions of existence begin to resonate in the same space. What happens when they align? Do we collapse into one unified reality? Or begin to coexist in a multiverse of layered presence where every choice lives on in some adjacent fold of space and time? In the end, these are not stories of lost explorers or cosmic accidents. They are stories of contact, of seeing ourselves in other times, other rules, other lives, and realizing we are not alone in our version of the world. There are other rooms in this house of being, other lights behind the walls, other songs, just faint enough to miss, until we stop and listen. Reality is not what we thought. And maybe, just maybe, it's better this way. Because if the universe can hold all these versions of life, then perhaps it can hold all of us too, even the forgotten ones, even the ones we've yet to become.